Now we can get started with the first section on how to enter invoices, and then we will show a demonstration. For this section, we're going to look at the non-purchase order invoice. And as discussed previously, this means this invoice is not linked to a purchase order. So in order to enter this invoice, the transaction code is FP60, which is enter invoice, specifically for accounts payable. And in this scenario, we're going to have an invoice for office supplies, and again, not linked to a purchase order, hence the different transaction. So for the master data, we've picked a vendor that we've got here. We're going to use company code 3000, our US company code, and document type KR. This document type, which is the SAP standard for enter invoice, this will default when you enter FP60. So as soon as you use FP60, SAP immediately knows this is for a vendor, and it will default the document type KR. So this is just for the information so you can see the difference between these types of invoices and non-PO invoices. Office supplies P&L account we'll enter, and because we're entering a P&L account, we're going to need a cost center. In this case, we're just going to use this marketing one, and because it's an invoice, we're going to need a tax code. In this course, we're not going to get bogged down with tax details, so I'm going to use the I0 or AP tax exempt code and just stick in a dummy tax jurisdiction code. So that we don't have to specifically analyze taxes. In your individual company, depending on whether you have Vertex in the US integrated for tax or you're in Europe using VAT, will determine the tax codes and the nature of the transactions. So this course is not going to delve into the details of tax, but we do need to have those things as a minimum in the transaction. Okay, so that being said, we've got our master data, we've got our specific transaction. We know it's not going to be linked to a PO and it's going to be a KR document type. Let's get into the demonstration. So these invoices are going to be under financial accounting, and instead of going to general ledger, we're going to go into accounts payable, as we're going to be using the accounts payable subledger. It's in the document entry, FP60, first one top of the list, dedicated for vendor transactions. So let's go into FP60. You'll see that vendor is the first field lit up at the top. The SAP knows this is an invoice. So let's enter our vendor and an invoice date. Now, the thing to note is that the invoice date is really going to be the key reference for your baseline date for your payment terms. And there's the KR document type we mentioned before. And just reiterating again that the invoice date and the posting date are different. Posting date, the accounting posting date, the invoice date for the payment terms. So let's enter an amount in there, the header section, and this is the vendor invoice amount. Then we've got our tax code section. So in this case, I'm going to go for calculate tax automatically, even though it's on 0. And you'll notice as soon as you enter the tax code, the header section fills out in the system. So now you can review the vendor details to make sure you've got the right vendor and address. And you can also see a snapshot of the vendor bank account details. And this is for company code 3000. So I suggest filling out the header section first before going to line items. The line items, we can enter a P&L account. For office expenses, this is the debit. Now we can enter our amount, and we're just going to make that balance for the top, as we've not got any tax jurisdiction code for the US. We can get that in, and you'll notice the tax code defaults from the top line to the bottom, so you don't have to retype it in. And as this is a P&L account, we need to enter a cost center, so we'll scroll along, find our cost center field, cost center, because we have a P&L account. And then to finish off, let's add some text in there describing our invoice, maybe some printer ink as an example. And therefore, we'd have the debit and the credit side of the transaction. When I press enter, notice this net due date warning message is really just telling us that according to the invoice date of the 1st of January, this invoice is overdue already. And that I'm acknowledging as part of this process. But the key difference here in an AP invoice is that you can also look at payment details. So besides seeing that the transaction is balanced in a similar way to a journal where we've got our debits and credits balanced, we can now look at the payment details tab. So here you can see this baseline date has been copied over from the invoice date. And the due date is going to be based on the invoice date itself. So invoice date copied to baseline date. We apply some payment terms, which in this case is 30 days, so the net due date is the end of the month. So it's just important to understand how those dates are used compared to a general ledger journal. So we can simulate this transaction. Just have a final review of our debits and credits, and as you can see in SAP, as per the usual style, the posting key is now taking over from the debit credit words, the way SAP tracks. We've got a balance transaction, and therefore we can go ahead and post our first non-PO invoice. And the system comes down and reports now there's the document number in the 19 series range. So you've just successfully posted your first non-PO invoice. Congratulations.